Welcome back to the deep dive. So if you've been wondering whether generative AI is mainly for, coding or maybe writing emails or perhaps just making terrible rap songs, you are definitely in the right place.
Yeah.
Today, we are really getting into the best source of truth we have on how AI is actually being used.
Right.
We're talking massive internal privacy-preserving data collected right from the source, tracking usage patterns all the way up through July 2025.
Which is key.
Exactly. This lets us finally move past all the self-reported surveys, the ones where people say what they think they do and see what the world is really doing with these tools.
And the scale here, it's just, well, it's astronomical. By July 2025, this platform hit 700 million weekly active users.
700 million weekly.
Weekly. Think about that. That's roughly 10% of the entire global adult population.
Wow.
And they were sending something like 18 billion messages every single week. That breaks down to about 2.5 billion conversations every day.
That volume is just hard to even comprehend. So our mission today for this deep dive is really to cut through the noise, right? All the industry speculation, maybe some wishful thinking that's dominated headlines.
Absolutely.
We need to figure out where all that user attention is really flowing and, maybe more importantly, where the actual value, economic or personal, is being created. Okay, so let's unpack the biggest headline right away, because this seems to run directly counter to that early narrative, the one that said AI was going to primarily, take over the workplace.
Right, the productivity focus.
Exactly. For the last couple of years, it feels like all the talk has been about productivity suites disrupting corporations. So what did this internal data actually reveal about work versus non-work usage?
Well, the big surprise is this really dramatic shift towards personal use. If you go back to June 2024, messages were split almost evenly. It was 53% non-work, 47% work. Pretty close.
Okay, almost 50-50 back then.
Yeah.
And what did that look like by, say, summer 2025? Did work usage finally pull ahead?
No, quite the opposite, actually. By June 2025, non-work usage accounted for more than 70% of all consumer messages.
70%.
73% to be specific. So only about a quarter, maybe a bit more, of consumer interaction actually relates to paid employment.
That's fascinating. So if only, 27% of consumer use is tied to a paying job, but the overall volume is massive and still growing, what does that tell us about the economic impact? We usually measure that by, company savings or profits.
It means we really have to adjust how we think about the value being generated here.
Yep.
This huge swell in non-work activity, it highlights substantial consumer surplus.
Consumer surplus.
Yeah, and economic impact that's happening outside of traditional jobs. Essentially, this value is flowing into consumer welfare and what economists sometimes call home production.
Okay, so helping you with your studies, managing personal finances, organizing your life, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Stuff that has real value, but it never shows up on a company's balance sheet.
Right. So AI is creating value in your life that maybe you would have had to pay for otherwise, or perhaps just wouldn't have gotten around to doing.
That's the idea.
Okay, so if this massive value is flowing into personal welfare outside of work, we need to know what people are actually spending that welfare on. What topics are they actually talking about?
Right. So when we categorize the actual content of those, 18 billion weekly messages, the results are pretty clear. The three most common topics account for nearly 80% of all usage.
80% from just 3 topics. What are they?
Practical guidance leads the pack. That's about 28.8%. Then comes seeking information at 24.4% and writing at 23.9%.
Okay, practical guidance, seeking information, writing. That feels pretty intuitive, actually. Everyone needs quick advice, facts, help drafting things. But let's zoom in on writing for a second, because that's the one that gets tied most often to, job displacement fears. If writing is about a quarter of all use, is that where people are replacing their job functions?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, especially when you look specifically at how writing is used at work. There, it accounts for a huge 40% of all work-related messages.
40% at work is writing. Okay.
But here's the key nuance. Approximately 2/3 of all those writing messages, work or personal, are requests to modify text the user provided.
Modify.
Yeah.
So wait, they aren't asking the AI to, write a whole report from scratch. They're asking it to edit something or critique it or summarize, maybe translate something they already wrote.
Precisely. Yeah. They're feeding it their own draft, their own input, and using the AI more like an editorial assistant, not the primary author.
So they're refining their own work.
Exactly. Kind of shifts the skill involved, doesn't it? The human moves more towards providing good input and then critiquing the output.
Hold on, if people are mostly just editing their own stuff, where's all the talk coming from about AI replacing entire writing departments? Does this finding maybe reduce that perceived threat of, full automation?
Well, it certainly complicates it. It suggests the main demand isn't purely for generating content out of thin air, but more for reducing friction, speeding up editing, making refinement easier. Not necessarily eliminating the need for a human to draft something in the first place.
Interesting. Now, what about those categories we maybe expected to be huge early on, the ones that got all the headlines, like coding help or, I don't know, relationship advice?
Yeah, those turned out to be surprisingly small, actually. After all the hype about AI coding the future,
Right.
computer programming and technical help overall was only 4.2% of total messages, and that share is actually declining.
Wait, hang on. Only 4.2% for coding. People are spending, what, 7 times more time asking for practical life advice than asking it to write code?
That's what the data shows.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the whole companionship angle, almost negligible.
Really?
Relationships and personal reflection was only 1.9%.
Yeah.
And things like games or role play, a tiny 0.4%. It's pretty clear the main value people are getting right now is utility, not emotional connection.
Okay. On that utility note, though, where else is serious personal value being created? Any other standouts?
Tutoring or teaching, that accounts for a pretty significant chunk, 10.2% of all user messages.
Wow, okay. So education is a big one.
Yeah, it highlights that growing educational use case. And we've also seen really huge rapid growth in multimedia creation that spiked right after image generation capabilities were released back in April 2025.
Wow.
And now multimedia accounts for about 7.3% of usage.
Okay, so to understand the user's goal, their actual intent, the research broke messages down into 3 main types: asking, doing, or expressing.
Mm-hmm.
Asking is basically seeking advice or info to make a decision. Doing is requesting a specific output or task, like writing code or drafting that email. And expressing is just, well, sharing views without a clear task.
Right. So when we look at overall consumer usage, just general users, what did the data show? Was it more about asking for guidance or asking for output? Did it challenge those early assumptions?
It seems asking dominates doing for general users. It sits at about 49% asking versus 40% doing. So the average consumer is slightly more interested in consultation than pure automation.
And that ratio is really critical because it connects directly to quality and how satisfied users are.
How so?
Well, asking messages are consistently rated much higher quality by the users themselves. If you look at the satisfaction ratio, basically the good versus bad ratings for asking, it's 4.45.
Okay, high satisfaction for asking.
But for doing, it's significantly lower, only 2.76.
Wow, that is a pretty stark difference. So it suggests users get much more satisfaction from decision support, from guidance, than they do from just getting automated output generated for them.
That's a great way to put it. We seem to prefer AI helping us think rather than just thinking for us.
That seems like a core takeaway for the consumer space then.
It does, however, the work environment completely flips this dynamic.
Ah, okay. How so?
Work-related messages are dominated by doing. It's 56% doing versus only 35% asking.
And that kind of makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? At work, you often have an immediate need to produce something specific, tangible outputs like emails, documents, code snippets, reports,
Exactly. You need that finished product.
which reflects that finding earlier, was it 35% of all work queries are specifically doing writing tasks?
Precisely connects.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look at demographics. Early on, there was a lot of talk about a significant gender gap in AI usage. Did the data confirm that, or did something change dramatically by 2025?
Oh, that narrative has changed. Quite dramatically, actually. Yes, early adopters were disproportionately male. The data showed something like 80% typically masculine names initially.
80%. Yeah.
But by June 2025, that initial gap had basically closed. And active users were actually slightly more likely to have typically feminine names at 52.4%.
Wow, so it's really become a normalized tool across genders.
It really seems so. Truly mainstream.
What about age? Is this still primarily a Gen Z thing?
Well, young people definitely dominate the sheer volume. Nearly half, 46% of all adult messages come from the 18 to 25 age group.
Okay, almost half from young adults.
However, we see a really key difference when we specifically isolate work usage.
Right. Where is the AI being used most for actual paid labor?
Work usage is much higher among the older prime working age groups. So for example, folks in the 36 to 45 bracket, 31.4% of their messages are work-related.
Okay.
Compare that to the youngest group, 18 to 25, where it's only 22.5% work-related. And the oldest users, 66 plus, it's down at 16.1%.
So it suggests the older, maybe more established professionals are the ones really integrating AI into their day-to-day workflows.
That seems to be the pattern, yeah.
And what about globally? Has adoption stayed concentrated in, say, high-income countries?
No, actually, the data shows growth has been particularly faster in low and middle income countries over the last year. Places with GDP per capita between $10,000 and $40,000.
Interesting. So it's demonstrating value where maybe resources, including time, are scarcer.
That could be part of it, yeah.
Okay, finally, let's try and tie this back to that idea of asking as decision support.
Yeah.
Does that hold true even for the most educated, maybe highest paid professionals?
Absolutely. It seems educated users in those highly paid professional roles are significantly more likely to use ChatGPT for work, and they are also more likely to send asking-type messages.
Got it.
So it strongly reinforces this idea of AI functioning more like a decision support co-pilot, especially for knowledge-intensive jobs, rather than just a simple task automator. And we can actually test this decision support idea more rigorously in the workplace using something called the Minute taxonomy.
That categorizes different job tasks.
Exactly. And what we found analyzing the work usage through that lens is that the majority of it, 57.9%, falls squarely into two broad functional areas.
Okay, and what are those two main areas?
First, things related to obtaining, documenting, and interpreting information.
Makes sense.
And second, activities centered on making decisions, giving advice, solving problems, and thinking creatively.
So again, quite high-level functions, not just routine tasks.
Definitely. And what's really fascinating here is the consistency. Even though you're looking at wildly different job titles, managers, scientists, salespeople, the core activities people use ChatGPT for are remarkably similar across these different professions.
Really? The same kinds of tasks pop up everywhere.
That's perhaps the most profound finding. Activities like making decisions and solving problems and documenting or recording information, they rank really highly, often in the top 5, across almost all the occupation groups they observed.
So the AI is being used to support these sort of fundamental building blocks of white-collar work, regardless of the specific job.
It certainly looks that way.
Okay, so when we put all these pieces together, the high consumer satisfaction with asking, the preference for editing over generating from scratch, this one-et data showing decision support, what's the definitive conclusion? How do people actually value this tech?
Well, the data really points strongly towards ChatGPT being primarily valued as an advisor, maybe a research assistant, essentially a tool for decision support. Rather than just being seen as a high-speed automation tool that just churns out generic, finished output, the real value seems to be derived from improving the speed and the quality of human decision-making. Hashtag outro.
So to maybe summarize this whole deep dive, it looks like the economic value of ChatGPT is increasingly shifting outside the traditional workplace into personal life, education, providing this huge, often unmeasured consumer surplus.
Right.
And crucially, within the workplace, its greatest value seems to be found in providing that decision support function, especially in complex, knowledge-heavy jobs.
This leaves us with a really interesting, maybe provocative thought to consider. We just saw that the work activities people use AI for are surprisingly consistent across very different job titles. It's mostly about interpreting information and supporting decisions. So if AI increasingly handles that informational groundwork, the synthesis, across pretty much all white-collar jobs, what human skills become the most valuable? The ones that rely on critical application, maybe leadership, human judgment.
Yeah, where does the human focus shift? Exactly. Do we need to pivot our focus entirely away from just processing information and towards the, the art of action and application?
Yeah.
Something to think about?